The 67th session of the Senate in the first regular session of the 17th Congress is hereby called to order. Senator Antonio Sani Trillanes IV will lead us in prayer.
In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, Amen. Heavenly Father, we come to you with grateful hearts today, praising you with all our being. Forgive our faults and help us to walk closer to your way. Help us to never stray away from your holy light and will. As we stand before you, we are humbly calling for your divine grace and guidance to take us to the right path and lead us to choices that will bring you glory. Guide us in our proceedings today, that we may do what is right and just according to your will. May your peace fill our hearts, and may we all continue to grow in your light and love. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
The Jose Rizal University Chorale will lead us in the singing of the Philippine National Anthem. The group will also render a song entitled Paraiso. Dwin. Thank you. J.R.U. Corral. Secretary, please call the roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senators Angara, Aquino, Binay, Cayetano, De Lima, Dulon, Ejercito, Escudero, Gatchalian, Gordon, Honasan, Hontiveros, Lacson, Ligada, Pacquiao, Pangilinan, Po, Recto, Soto, Trillanes, Villanueva, Villar, Zuberi, Senate President Pimentel.
With 23 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the journal of the 66th session Wednesday, February 22, 2017, and consider the same as approved.
Any objection? There being none, we dispense with the reading of the journal of the 66th session Wednesday, February 22, 2017, and consider the same as approved.
Mr. President, there are guests of Senator Alan Cayetano who would like to welcome them. The board member Philip Lee, ABC of Albay, board member Narciso Bernardo of ABC Romblon, Vice Mayor Herbert Borja, and members of the Sangguniang Bayan of Pulangi Albay. And I'd like to acknowledge Mr. and Mrs. Ola Eriksson and family from Stavanger, Norway, and guests of Senator Cayetano, ladies of the Ageless Society of Davao, Mr. President.
Welcome to all of our guests.
Mr. President, Senator Manny Pacquiao wishes to seek the floor, Mr. President.
Is there any objection? There being none, Senator Pacquiao is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that that the position of the Senate President pro tempore be declared vacant.
Any objection? Senator Dillon.
I will not interpolate Senator Pacquiao, Mr. President. I second the motion.
Any objection? There being none, the motion is approved. We proceed. There's no objection, so the motion is approved. Majority Leader,
May I have a 1-minute suspension, Mr. President?
session is suspended. Paki-ready out ka lang. Session is resumed.
Senator Pacquiao would like to be recognized, Mr. President.
Is there an objection? There being none, Senator Pacquiao is recognized.
Mr. President, I nominate Senator Ralph Recto to the position of Senate President pro tempore.
Any other nominations? The nomination has been seconded by Senator Escudero. Shall we close the nomination process, Majority Leader?
Yes, Mr. President, I move that we close the period of the nomination
Mag-raise
period.
yung hands pa rin, ano? Okay, for the record, since we need to achieve a certain number of votes, we will have to vote on the motion by the raising of hands, and your votes will be recorded. So those who are voting for Senator Recto as the new Senate President pro tempore, please raise your hand. Did we get it? Yeah, I don't need. Give me the result, please. Yes. No, it's a number, we only need to announce the number of votes. With 17 votes for Senator Recto as the new Senate President pro tempore, he is hereby elected as the Senate President pro tempore. Can we call Senator Recto to take his oath of office? Up here. Raise your right hand and state your oath of office. I, state your name.
I, Ralph Recto,
Having been elected Senate President pro tempore,
having been elected Senate President pro tempore,
do hereby solemnly swear
do hereby solemnly
that
swear
I will well and faithfully discharge
that I will well and faithfully discharge
to the best of my ability
to the best of my ability
the duties of my present position
the duties of my present position
and of all other I may hereafter hold
and of all other I may hereafter hold
under the Republic of the Philippines.
under the Republic of the Philippines.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the Philippines.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the Philippines.
That I will obey the laws and legal orders
That I will obey the laws and legal orders
and decrees promulgated by the duly constituted authorities
and decrees promulgated by the duly constituted authorities
and maintain true faith and allegiance
and maintain true faith and allegiance
to the Republic of the
to the
Philippines.
Republic of the Philippines.
And that I impose this obligation upon myself
And that I impose this obligation upon myself
voluntarily
voluntarily
without mental reservation
without mental reservation
or purpose of evasion.
or purpose of
So
evasion.
help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we recognize Senator Manny Pacquiao.
Any objection? There being none, Senator Pacquiao is recognized.
Mr. President, I move to that the chairmanship and members of the Committee on Health be declared vacant, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved. Senator Antiveros.
I second the motion, Mr. President.
Thank you. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we elect Senator J.B. Ercito as Chairman of the Committee on Health.
Any objection? There being none, Senator Ejercito is the new chairman of the Committee on Health.
Mr. President, I move that we recognize Senator Manny Pacquiao.
Any objection? There being none, Senator Pacquiao is recognized.
Mr. President, I move that the chairmanship and members of the Committee on Agriculture be declared vacant, Mr.
Any
President.
objection? There being none, motion is approved. Senator Pangilinan.
We would like to place on record that, well, prior to the approval of the motion, we would have seconded the motion.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Mr. President, I move that we elect Senator Cynthia Villar as Chairman of the Committee on Agriculture.
Any objection? There being none, Senator Villar is now the new chairman of the Committee on Agriculture.
Mr. President, I move to recognize Senator Manny Pacquiao.
Any objection? There being none, Senator Pacquiao is recognized.
Mr. President, I move that the chairmanship and members of the Committee on Education be declared vacant.
Any objection? Senator Aquino. Senator Aquino.
Mr. President, I second the motion.
Thank you. Senator Poe.
I would just like to put on record, Mr. President, just a manifestation that I think that Senator Bam did an excellent job as chairman of the Committee on Education, and I hope that whoever will be voted in his place will continue the initiatives that he has started. Thank you, Mr. President.
That will not be treated as an objection. So there being no objection, motion is approved.
Mr. President, I move that we elect Senator Chis Escudero as Chairman of the Committee on Education.
Any objection? There being none, Senator Escudero is now the new chairman of the Committee on Education. Majority
Pres-
Leader?
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
Any objection? Senator Aquino?
Mr. President, thank you for allowing me a few minutes of your time. Alam mo, Mr. President, lahat naman tayo dito mga politiko. Lahat naman tayo dito mga big boys and big girls. And I take no offense to this removal of my chairmanship in education. But for the record, Mr. President, I would just like to state for the record, and I hope no one will object, that this move, Mr. President, has nothing to do with the performance of the Committee on Education. Two of the priority bills that we have filed and are currently discussing and hopefully will pass before the end of March, yung Pagkain Pinoy para sa Batang Pinoy Bill, and of course our Free Higher Education Act, Mr. President, has gone through numerous hearings, has gone through numerous consultations. We've put the time into these bills, Mr. President, and we will support Senator Escudero when he finalizes these bills and hopefully gets a second and third reading, Mr. President, here on the Senate floor. Mr. President, never in my 4 years as a senator have I seen support for this bill. Support as much for these two bills. Mr. President, yung Free Education Act, I think there were already 11 or 12 co-sponsors. There were a number of co-authors. Yung Pagkain Pinoy, Mr. President, also had a similar number of support from our colleagues. So for the record, Mr. President, let me just say that it was a pleasure being your Committee on Education Chairman. And Mr. President, if this is the price to pay to show up on the streets of EDSA, talking about democracy, talking about the issues of violence in our streets, if this is the price to pay, Mr. President, I gladly pay that price. Maraming salamat, Mr. President.
Thank you for the manifestation. Let's go to the pending motion that we proceed with the reference of business. Any objection? Senator Pangilinan?
Just a clarification, Mr. President, before we proceed, we act on the motion. Considering that the former minority leader is now elected as Senate President pro tem, may we know who the minority leader, who will act as minority leader, Mr. President?
Senator Recto is recognized.
Just a manifestation and maybe to help answer the question. Mr. President, I accept the pro tem and I thank my colleagues, the majority of whom have voted me to the position of pro tem. Precisely knowing or finding out today what will happen, I thought it was best to accept the offer of the majority to be pro tem, to open up the position of minority leader to any of our colleagues who may be joining the minority. At this point in time, I suppose that the minority leader would be Senator Trillanes until the minority decides among themselves who would be the minority leader. Thank you.
Senator Pangilinan?
Mr. President, with that manifestation, I will place on record that I would like to associate myself with the members of the minority of this chamber.
Thank you. Senator Drilon?
I adopt the manifestation of Senator Pangilinan, and therefore it is proper at this stage that we rearrange the seats in the chamber.
Thank you. Who else? Senator Aquino?
Mr. President, likewise, I manifest that I will also be joining the minority.
Were you raising your hand, Senator Tiveros? Yes, sir. Senator Tiveros?
Thank you, Mr. President. I also proudly joined the minority of the Senate today. Salamat po.
Thank you. Senator Pangilinan? Yes.
I took a few moments, Mr. President, hoping that perhaps other members of the chamber would also associate themselves and join the minority, but it looks like that's it, Mr. President. Having said that, Mr. President, we may be allowed perhaps a day or so to sit down with our colleagues in the minority to discuss, if at all, a reorganization or the matter of the issue of who the minority leader will be. And as such, make the necessary manifestations at the proper time, at a later time, Mr. President.
Is there any objection to proceed with the reference of business as of this moment? Senator Drilon?
So, just to make the records clear, the members of the minority today
will be Senator Trillanes, this representation, Senator Risa Hontiveros, Senator Bam Aquino, Senator Kiko Pangilinan. And of course, we speak also for in behalf of Senator Laila de Lima as a member of the minority.
I think it's better to await formal communication from the good senator.
Yes, yes.
Regarding that matter, sir. Okay.
Yes.
But that's correct, sir. As of this moment, there will be 5 members of the minority.
Okay, we have no dispute with that, Mr. President.
What's the pleasure of Senator Pangilinan?
Yes, Mr. President, with the inclusion of at least, well, prior to the reorganization, Mr. President, there were 3 members of the minority. After the reorganization, Mr. President, there are now 5. This will therefore affect the entire proportionate representation in all the committees. May we know how we are to proceed, given the change in the proportionate representation of all committees, Mr. President?
Majority Leader? Yes, can we answer that question later because we have a pending motion to proceed with the reference of business? Any objection? There being none, the motion is approved. Secretary, let us proceed with the reference of business.
Reference of business. Message of the President of the Philippines. Letter of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte dated 15 February 2017, submitting to the Senate's consideration the agreement between the Government of the Republic of the Philippines and the Government of the Republic of Indonesia concerning the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone boundary, which was signed on 23rd May 2014 in Manila, Philippines.
Referred to the Committee on Foreign Relations.
Bills on first reading. 1349, an act naming the intersection of Jose Abad Santos Avenue, Gapan, San Fernando, Olongapo Road, and the Guagua, Florida Blanca Provincial Road, located at the border of Barangay San Antonio and Barangay Jose Abad Santos, both in the municipality of Guagua, province of Pampanga, as the William Gulanco Junction. Senator Maria Lourdes Nancy Binay.
To the Committee on Public Works.
1350, an act officially creating Barangay Ascomo, Municipality of Guagua, Province of Pampanga, into a barangay for other purposes. Senator Maria Lourdes Nancy Binay.
To the Committee on Rules.
1351, an act regulating the establishment and implementation of agribusiness ventures arrangements in agrarian reform lands. Senator Risa Hontiveros.
To the Committee on Agrarian Reform.
Resolutions, number 301, resolution directing the Committee on Public Services as part of its oversight function to conduct an inquiry on the reported bus accident that tragically claimed the lives of 15 passengers, mostly students, from Bestlink College of the Philippines, and to review existing laws and policies with regard to ensuring the roadworthiness of public utility vehicles and the competence of drivers of such vehicles. Senator Grace Poe.
To the Committee on Public Services.
302, resolution directing the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations to investigate, in aid of legislation, the status of the Manila Economic and Cultural Office, the country's representative office in Taiwan, in order to prevent possible violations of the One China policy. Senator Aquilino Coco Pimentel III.
To the Committee on Foreign Relations.
Committee reports. Committee report number 37 submitted jointly by the Committees on Civil Service, Government Reorganization and Professional Regulation and Finance on Senate Bill number 286 introduced by Senator Trillanes IV, entitled An Act Providing for a Cost of Living Allowance for all officials and employees of the government sector and for other related purposes. recommending its approval with amendment, Senator Trillanes IV.
To the calendar for ordinary business.
Committee Report Number 38, submitted jointly by the Committees on Civil Service, Government Reorganization and Professional Regulation and Finance on Senate Bill Number 453, introduced by Senator Trillanes IV, entitled An Act Granting Survivorship Benefits to the surviving legitimate spouse of a deceased retired member of the Office of Solicitor General, recommending its approval with amendments, Senator Trillanes IV.
To the calendar for ordinary business.
Committee Report Number 39, submitted jointly by the Committees on Civil Service, Government Reorganization and Professional Regulation and Finance on Senate Bill Number 807, introduced by Senator Trillanes IV, entitled An Act Increasing to 3,000 pesos the monthly personnel economic relief allowance granted to government employees, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes, recommending its approval without amendment, Senator Trillanes IV.
To the calendar for ordinary business. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, with the permission of the Chamber, earlier, Senator Francis Pangilinan has withdrawn the availment of the privilege hour. So I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1256 under Committee Report Number 13.
Is there any objection? There being none, we resume consideration of Senate Bill Number 1256 under Committee Report Number 13.
Mr. President, this is the measure further amending the Anti-Money Laundering Act. Parliamentary status of the measure is that we are still in the period of interpellation. So I move to recognize the chairman of the Committee on Banks, Currencies and Financial Institutions, Senator Francis Escudero, and to interpellate Senator Franklin Drilon.
Can we have a minute suspension as
Yes,
the
move to suspend the session for a few minutes, Mr. President.
session is suspended? Wait.
Which one is the clean version? Ito na yung clean version. We're ready, Mr. President.
Session is resumed. The sponsor, Senator, there's a pending motion to recognize the sponsor. So Senator Escudero is recognized and Senator Drilon to interpolate is also recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the gentleman sponsor yield to a few questions in relation to this matter, to this bill?
Willingly, Mr. President, Your Honor, but as a preface, we have been discussing with Senator De Lima the points she raised in her interpellation as well as in discussions with the staff of Senator Drilon, and we have made several adjustments and amendments to the committee report already, and we will be answering based on those adjustments, Mr. President, Your Honor, and I will inform the good senator as we go along, depending on the provisions he will ask on. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, to start with, for the record, why are we amending today the Anti-Money Laundering Act? For the record.
Because, Mr. President, we met with representatives of the Asia Pacific Group, which is under FATF, and they made several observations and recommendations in relation to our country's compliance with the APG and FATF rules and regulations, hopefully in time for their June meeting of 2017. We took note of those suggestions and recommendations, Mr. President, Your Honor, hence the proposed amendment to the existing AMLA law.
Can we have a 1 minute suspension? I cannot hear.
Session is suspended for a few minutes.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
If I get correctly, the good sponsor, he was mentioning that he met with the Asia Pacific group and there were certain shortcomings which the FATF would want us to address in order that we will be compliant. Is that correct, Mr. President?
That is correct, Mr. President, Your Honor. In fact, one of those meetings was held right here in the Senate President's conference room.
All right. May I know what are these gaps in the law that the Asia Pacific group would want us to address?
Mr. President, Your Honor, number one would be the coverage of casinos and allied casino businesses within the purview of AMLAC. Number two, Mr. President, Your Honor, the threshold of $10,000 US and or 500,000 pesos, that any other threshold exceeding this amount would be as if there is no threshold from their point of view. The coverage of real estate brokers, Mr. President, Your Honor, and the inclusion of certain predicate offenses that we enumerated in the proposed bill.
Just to make the record clear, first, there is a proposed amendment on covered persons. Is that correct? When we said casinos
Casinos and real estate brokers,
and
Mr.
real
President.
estate brokers.
Yes, that is correct.
Now, what are there any other persons who would be, which would be covered in the amendments other than casinos and real estate developers, brokers, and sales agents?
That's the limit of their recommendation, Mr. President, Your Honor. Only casinos and real estate brokers.
Now, in the bill, what are there other persons we wish to cover other than casinos and real estate developers, brokers, and agents?
Mr. President, part of the amendment would be money service business or money transfer, which is part of the old law. However, it was only sought to be clarified by a separate enumeration. Trust and company service providers, but clarifying only the provision as well, because this was originally in the original AMLA law. Dealers in precious stones, jewels, and or precious metals also was in the previous law, but we clarified it, Mr. President, Your Honor. Dealers in high-value items, we added this, Mr. President, Your Honor, because it was discussed in one of the technical working group meetings that we discussed, for example, the Rolex watch, Mr. President, Your Honor. The value of the Rolex watch is in the brand, not in the jewels found in the watch. And that therefore, if the value exceeds a certain amount, then it should be covered as well, because not everything is based on the amount of jewelry in a particular good that is being sold in the country. Those are the things. That's the only thing, Mr. President, actually, that we added in addition to the clarifications I just mentioned.
So, just to make it very clear, the proposed amendment will include new covered persons, namely dealers of high-value items, real estate developers, and casinos. Is that correct, Mr. President?
Mr. President, to clarify, The recommendation of FATF, which is not in the original law, would be real estate developers and casinos.
Yes.
The other enumerations, we simply clarified it. The only new covered person that came from your committee would be the dealers of high-value items or goods, which we define as anything in excess of ₱1 million.
All right. So the FATF wanted real estate developers and casinos to be included as in the definition of covered persons. The committee, in its judgment, proposes the inclusion of the dealers of high-value items or goods, and the money, and other than this, the inclusion of money service business or money transfer companies, the trust and service providers, the dealers in previous of precious stones are already in the law, but the committee report would try to clarify it. Is that a correct
That is
statement?
correct, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Now, what about covered transactions? What are the proposed amendments on covered transactions?
Mr. President, in our meetings with the APG representatives, it was made clear to us that they were only concerned with cash transactions, with the exception of certain entities that deal with banking and or other notes. Therefore, the amendment in this particular provision is we clarified. Only cash transactions will be covered and need to be reported. Those that need to report other than cash transactions would be those supervised and regulated by the BSP and casinos who use other instruments with respect to their transactions. For example, Mr. President, Your Honor, if a person buys a piece of real estate and he or she pays using a check,
Sorry?
the buyer uses a check
Yes.
to pay, that is not a covered transaction under our proposed measure. Under the previous law, anything in excess of 500,000 would have to be reported. In our proposed amendment, only when you pay in cash and you're a covered person should you actually report, and only that time will it be a covered transaction. If a check is used, that should be covered already by the bank concerned that issued the check or owns the check.
So that in that case, if it's a check that is used for the payment of the transaction, the real estate developer would have no obligation to report, because theoretically it is the bank who is supposed to report a covered transaction or a suspicious transaction.
That is correct, Mr. President, Your Honor, because we wanted to relieve them of that burden of deciding and evaluating these matters, when in truth and in fact, banks or supervised institutions of the BSP are required to have a certain standard or level of diligence with respect to such transactions. Besides, they're used to doing it already under the existing law.
All right. Now, in other cases, where the threshold is, what is the threshold for other transactions which will be deemed covered?
We made the threshold uniform, Mr. President, Your Honor. There is only one mention of a threshold now, only 500,000. Because as I said earlier, any amount in excess of 500,000 would be as if there is no threshold from the point of view of the APG and the FATF.
Yes. Now, under the current law, the amount, the amount in excess of 500,000 within one working day is considered a covered transaction, which will prompt a report. Now, the one banking day rule has been removed. What is the intention? In other words, it is no longer a requirement that the 500,000 deposit be made in one banking day? Is that
It was removed, Mr. President, because the reckoning point would be per transaction. No single transaction should exceed 500,000. Otherwise, reportorial requirements would kick in.
So that if he deposits in one banking day 100,000 5 times, is that a covered transaction?
No, Mr. President, Your Honor.
No. And therefore, no reporting would be required? Are we certain about that?
That is correct, Mr. President, Your Honor. However, the bank can identify it as a suspicious transaction if that is how you do your business on a daily, as a matter of course, rather. It may be identified as a suspicious transaction or an attempt to circumvent the provisions of the AMLAC law.
It is not a suspicious transaction if depositing 100,000 per transaction is in the normal course of your business.
Exactly, Mr. President,
Now,
Your Honor.
If you deposited 100,000 suddenly 4 times in one day or 4 times in one day, is that a suspicious transaction?
Not automatically, Mr. President, Your Honor. The law requires that, for example, a banking institution have its own risk analysis in identifying what a suspicious transaction is or will be. But it does not necessarily mean that it is automatically tagged as a suspicious transaction simply because it is not in the ordinary course of your day-to-day banking transactions.
We just want all of these opinions on record so that we can really determine whether the banks are complying with their obligations under the law. Now, this threshold of 500,000, the Anti-Money Laundering Council is being empowered to set or amend these thresholds?
Yes, Mr. President, Your Honor. That is not, I will clarify, Mr. President, Your Honor, that is not an APG FATF.
That's correct.
That came from your committee already because every once in a while they come to us and we have to meet, agree, and vote and pass another law in compliance. So we tried to establish a guideline by which adjustments can be made without need of congressional action.
Setting the amounts is a matter of law. When we set 500,000 as the threshold for reporting and in excess of 500,000 as the basis for flagging a suspicious transaction, these are amounts which we set in exercise of our function as legislators. Would the gentleman agree with that?
We agree, Mr. President, Your Honor, and we submit at the proper time. Either the gentleman can propose the amendment or we can do it ourselves, Mr. President, Your Honor. It was simply a facility that we tried to propose, but upon, again, consulting with other members of the Senate, indeed, there may be some constitutional bars and restrictions on us delegating this power to AMLAC.
Well, just for the record, we are willing to examine a proposition that will give to the AMLC the power, provided appropriate standards are identified in the law, so that there will be no abuses of such delegated authority.
We will propose, Mr. President, Your Honor, such standards if the gentleman will be amenable to it. But again, just to clarify, this is not one of the recommendations of APG FATF.
All right. Very well, Mr. President. Now, as we said earlier, under the present law, a covered transaction is a transaction in cash or other equivalent monetary instrument involving a total amount in excess of 500,000 within one banking day. And we have deleted one banking day. But when it is a suspicious transaction account, the same standard would be followed in the reporting requirement of that account.
Yes, Mr. President, Your Honor, but just to clarify, the other equivalent monetary instrument only applies to agencies, to entities or corporations supervised by the BSP and casinos, not to everyone else. For example, it does not apply to real estate brokers. It does not apply to dealers in precious metals, in high-value items. It only applies to those regulated or supervised by the BSP and casinos.
All right, and in certain instances, only transactions in cash would be deemed as a covered transaction, as in the case of real estate developers.
That is correct, Mr. President. Your Honor.
What is the rationale for this, Mr. President? The FATF, in providing for thresholds, as far as we know, used the term financial transactions and did not limit the same to cash transactions.
We clarified this with them, Mr. President, Your Honor. In fact, even the members of the Senate who participated in the amendments earlier were shocked to hear this from APG and FATF, that they were actually just concerned with cash transactions, except for, as I said, banks and or casinos who usually use monetary instruments. I asked that of them actually more than 3 times, over and over, just to clarify it. And from my point of view, Mr. President, Your Honor, this is less burdensome on the part of covered persons if we introduce this dichotomy between purely cash and those using the equivalent monetary instruments.
Yeah. Well, I just want to spread into the record the reasons for this.
For the record, Mr. President, Your Honor, this is compliant with APG, FATF, this dichotomy,
All right.
even if we made it lighter for some covered persons.
Now, what is the threshold insofar as the casinos are concerned in terms of the amounts?
Same amount, Mr. President,
How much?
Your Honor, 500,000 pesos or its equivalent.
Didn't the FA, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't the threshold of the FATF 3,000 euros? In other words, transactions 100 or 3,000 euros in the equivalent local currency would put it at the level of a reporting requirement?
The 3,000 euro requirement, Mr. President, Your Honor, is only for the CDD or customer
For
due
the-
diligence. CDD, customer due diligence. That anyone who bets in excess, CDD or customer due diligence applies, they should know who the bettor or player is. But for reportorial purposes, it's still $10,000 or its equivalent. That's what they use in other jurisdictions, Mr. President. But here we only have one threshold. 500,000.
Can the good sponsor spread into the record how that will work in terms of the obligation to report? If I got the sponsor correctly, he said if the single bet is 500,000, it would be a covered transaction.
If it's in excess of 500,000, yes.
If
it would
it's
be-
in excess of 500,000. But under the, is it correct that under the FATF standard, any transaction beyond 160,000 pesos is a covered transaction which would trigger a report?
Mr. President, Your Honor, each individual bet, for example, in a baccarat table, if it exceeds 500,000, it is not a covered transaction yet. It's when they exchange the chips and the exchange of chips exceeds 500,000, then that's the report that they will have to make. Kasi may naglalaro ho ng casino isang buong araw. Gagawa siya ng isang pusta, 1 million, 2 million, hindi pa ho covered
Hindi
yan.
pa covered yan.
Hindi
It
pa.
is when he cashes in his check.
Yes,
his
and if it
chips.
exceeds 500,000, that's what will trigger the report, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Yeah,
Please.
yes, Senator Recto wishes to intervene.
Yeah, with the permission of the two gentlemen on the
Senator
floor.
Rectos, recognized.
Isn't it that it should be that when the bettor comes to the casino and he brings the cash to exchange for chips,
Again,
pag exchange niya at kumuha siya ng chip, doon pa lang
Kumbaga,
Covered
natutunan
transaction
natin
yan.
sa cage, no, nag-testify dito yung mga nagkakasino. It's the cage transactions that need to be reported. So when he gives cash in exchange for chips, that will be reported. If he exchanges his chips for cash, that will be reported too.
Or other monetary instruments.
Or other monetary instrument. That is correct. Hindi yung kada game. So in other words, to clarify, Mr. President, Your Honor, every cage transaction, I'm using cage as a technical term.
Yes.
Every cage transaction in excess of 500,000 pesos will trigger the reportorial requirement.
Including when he exchanged his chips for cash.
Yes.
What if he went to the casino and he paid through check?
A monetary instrument covers casinos, Mr. President, Your Honor.
And
Hindi lang siya
therefore,
cash.
that is reported.
That will be reported too.
So if he exchanged his chips naman for a check, that will also be reported.
That will also be reported because the exemption of cash transaction, Mr. President, Your Honor, as we enumerated in the proposed dichotomy, would be entities supervised by the BSP and casinos.
So if it's supervised by the BSP,
Like money changers, banks,
So it
anyone who
need not
pays in
be-
checks or receives a check should be
so
reported.
hindi lang cash yun.
Hindi lang
Pwede
cash.
cheque.
Pati cheque.
Thank you for that clarification.
Including wire transfers, to clarify, Mr. President, Your Honor, because usually wire transfers are used for casinos.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. I'll go to just one specific example, and I'll ask a question whether it is a covered transaction, which would trigger a report, either a regular report or a suspicious transaction report. A customer would go to the cage, would have 300,000 in cash exchanged for tips,
Chips.
for chips. What is the obligation of the casino?
He's not obliged to report it, but the proposed bill, Mr. President, Your Honor, requires that all covered persons, including casinos, should have a CDD, customer due diligence.
So it is not on the amount, but on the CDD?
The fact that he's a covered person, Mr. President, Your Honor, requires him to have CDD. Equivalent of, that's what they now call the Know Your Client rule.
I know, the
KYC.
KYC.
They're now
Because
changing
I
it
want
to
to clarify.
CDD.
I have no problems about whatever amount you place there. I was just interested in making sure that this bill that we are working on will be considered as compliant with the standards set forth. That's our interest here. From what I can see, the FATF recommendation is that the threshold is 3,000 euros. That's roughly equivalent to 160,000 as a covered transaction in the casino. So that if, so you have interpreted it to mean that this is the transaction in the cage. So that if I surrender amounts, the standard will be, is it in the threshold or not in the threshold? There are two thresholds that I see. One of the FATF, which is roughly 160,000, and the proposal found in the bill that we are debating on, 500,000. So I want to spread into the record that if the player goes to the cage and cashes or purchases chips to the amount of 300,000 pesos, the 300,000 is within the threshold amount imposed by the FATF, but that is outside of the threshold amount we have indicated in the bill. So what is the obligation of the casino?
Mr. President, Your Honor, I clarified from our technical team here. As I said earlier, the CDD threshold is 3,000 euro, roughly 160,000 pesos. That's the FATF APG standard. In the proposed bill, we seek to use only one standard. So the standard for the reportorial standard, we also applied to the CDD standard, which is in excess of what the FATF and APG
Yes.
actually require.
Yes.
Just to clarify where we're coming from, Mr. President.
But precisely, if it is in excess of what the FATF requires, they will come back to us again and say, your amendment is not compliant.
No, we are over compliant, Mr.
No,
President,
no,
Your
no,
Honor.
Mr. President.
Mr. President, because
Yeah.
the CDD...
Just to put my point across, and I will accept your explanation. I'm not disputing the amounts. I am just interested, Mr. President, in finding out what is the obligation of the casino. Insofar as the casino is concerned, what is the threshold? Assuming that we pass the bill in the form that you have placed, that the gentleman has reported out, if the amount is below 500,000, there is no reporting requirement. If the amount is 500,000 and above, there is a reporting requirement. However, the FATF, in its recommendation, said that the threshold amount is 3,000 euros, or roughly 160,000. My question is just to place of record. I'm not disputing whatever whatever is the proposal. I'm just interested in making sure that what we are doing, spending time, is in compliance with FATF standard.
Mr. President, Your Honor, in other jurisdictions, they have two threshold amounts. $10,000 for reportorial obligations of a covered person, and 3,000 euro, as you cited earlier, for the CDD rule to apply. Now, in the Philippines, as we are proposing, Mr. President, Your Honor, we are only proposing one threshold for both 500,000. Although the FATF recommendation is only 3,000 euro for CDD, we applied one and the same. We don't have a threshold for CDD.
Yes.
In fact, any customer of a covered person, we are requiring them to do CDD
Yes.
without any threshold. So this would be over compliant
No.
with what with what the FATF is requiring. Mr. President, FATF simply recommends if the transaction exceeds 3,000 euro, then you have to have CDD on him. In the Philippines, what we're proposing is, regardless of the transaction, if you're a covered person, you should have CDD on all your customers.
Mr. President, I submit this for further deliberation by the sponsor and his technical staff. But for the record, I believe that we are not compliant if the purpose of this bill is to comply, because from what I understand, the threshold amount is 500,000. If the transaction indicates is less than 500,000, under this bill, once it passes into law, under this bill, there is no reporting requirement because it's less than 500,000. But if it exceeds 160,000, then under the FATF recommendation, it should be a covered transaction. Now, I leave that on the record, and for the sponsor to look at it and study it again. If the sponsor says we are in compliance, we will accept that as the rule, and I hope that that is accepted by the FATF. But if not, then we have to go back again and debate on it again. That's all my point. I am not in love with either 160,000 or 500,000. I just want to be clarified.
We will revisit, Mr. President, Your Honor, and clarify with the representatives of APG and FATF and clarify the matter with the good senator as well, Mr. President.
on Section 3, Mr. President. Section 3 of the bill, of the measure, which is found on page 3, line 31, which proposes to amend Section 3B1. The suspicious transaction is defined as, regardless of the amounts involved, where the covered person suspects or has reasonable ground to suspect that the monetary instrument or property is the proceeds of or is any way related to a predicate offense. Under this act, that amount is about to be or being or has been committed, or, and this is what is worrisome, Mr. President, or a suspicious transaction is one where there are circumstances determined to be suspicious by the Anti-Money Laundering Council. It is suspicious transaction because it is so declared by the Anti-Money Laundering Council as suspicious. Isn't this a little worrisome and a little vague? What is a suspicious transaction? The answer is those which are considered suspicious by the AMLC. Isn't that vague, Mr. President, and therefore could be attacked because it lacks a comprehensible standard that common intelligence would would require an interpretation of what it all means. I would repeat, the way I read the proposal is that a suspicious transaction is transactions which are determined to be suspicious by the MLC.
We agree, Mr. President, Your Honor. In fact, this was one of the topics of discussion with Senator De Lima when she interpolated this representation. And in the amendments we will be making, Mr. President, Your Honor, we will be deleting number 7 already.
Thank you.
Isa po yan sa mga suggestions ni Senator De Lima sa bill, which we will be affecting ourselves.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm glad to hear that from the good sponsor. Now, predicate offenses. The predicate offenses under Section 3, Section 3.1 of the present law is sought to be amended by including other crimes or offenses as predicate offenses. Now, the amendment simply enumerates the laws, the violation of which will be considered as a predicate offense. I am a little bit concerned because one of those laws that are enumerated here, one of the laws enumerated here, is the National Internal Revenue Code. Any violation of the Internal Revenue Code would be considered as a predicate offense. Filing a tax return, which could be the subject of a audit or whatever, or there were some entries which are not which are disallowed, or a tax refund. In a broad sense, that is a violation of the National Internal Revenue Code. Will now that be considered as a predicate offense, which will trigger the authority of the AMLC to go to the Court of Appeals and petition for a freeze of the account of the taxpayer?
Mr. President, Your Honor, one of the enumerations of FATF, APG, and I will use what exactly the words they used, tax crimes related to direct and indirect taxes. However, Mr. President, Your Honor, Insofar as your committee is concerned, again, I preface our interpellation with the fact that we are making adjustments to the bill. We will be specifying, in fact, we already have the version specifying which particular sections only of the laws enumerated will be considered as a predicate offense and not the entire law, including the declaration of policy. We enumerated already in the proposed amendments the exact specific provisions. Now, insofar as the NIRC is concerned, it would only cover, in our proposed amendment by your committee, Mr. President, Your Honor, sections 254, 255, 257,
Yeah.
up to 254 to 265 only. And I can give the gentleman the enumeration and the specific titles of each section. Hindi po yung buong NIRC.
This is a very crucial provision. Would the gentleman be kind enough to provide us with the amendment that is proposed on Section 4 of the bill so that we can closely examine it as we said, this will trigger the powers to examine and even to freeze or petition to freeze. So it is very critical that we know what is the coverage of the predicate offenses so that we will be able to suggest amendments if we do not agree. We note, for example, that
We will do that, Mr. President,
all right.
Your Honor.
So we'll just await that submission and suspend our interpretation insofar as Section 4 of the bill is concerned, if that is in order.
Yes, Mr. President, Your Honor. In fact, I have a copy here and I can give it to him after the
Okay.
gentleman's interpellation.
Ikaw, kung gusto mo.
Yes, we would need that, especially because under Section 10 of the proposed measure, a freeze order is authorized against any monetary instrument or property that is, quote, in any way related to any predicate offense. So you can imagine how broad this is, Mr. President. I would repeat, it opens to a freeze order any monetary instrument or property that is, quote, in any way related to a predicate offense. The predicate offense is so broad that then any relation to that predicate offense will subject the depositor to remedies, to the powers to freeze, etc. That is why we are very concerned about the predicate offenses that are enumerated, because otherwise, unless we are careful about this, the overbreadth, is that correct? Doctrine will apply here. In other words, it is so broad that it becomes constitutionally infirm.
Mr. President, Your Honor, my apologies to the good gentleman. I listened intently to his suggestions while we were talking on the side, and that is one of your committee's proposed amendments, to remove the motu proprio power of the AMLC to issue a freeze order for 30 days, given the constitutional and due process hindrances that it may face, and also because, Mr. President, Your Honor, this is not a recommendation anyway.
And for that matter, Mr. President, talking about that, what are the predicate offenses as recommended by the FATF?
If I may spread it into the record, Mr.
Yes.
President, Your Honor. Number 1, participation in an organized criminal group and racketeering. Number 2, terrorism, including terrorist financing. Number 3, trafficking in human beings and migrant smuggling. Number 4, sexual exploitation, including sexual exploitation of children. Number 5, illicit trafficking in narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. illicit arms trafficking, illicit trafficking in stolen or other goods, corruption and bribery, fraud, counterfeiting currency, counterfeiting and piracy of products, environmental crime, murder, grievous bodily injury, kidnapping, illegal restraint, and hostage taking. Sorry, I missed the numbers. Number 15, robbery or theft. Number 16, smuggling, including in relation to customs and excise duties and taxes, tax crimes related to direct taxes and indirect taxes, extortion, forgery, piracy, and insider trading and market manipulation. That is the extent of the list that they gave us, Mr. President, Your Honor.
These are, our question really would refer to the new predicate crimes that the FATF now requires to be included.
Yes, Mr. President, and that's why we embodied that in the proposed bill. Bago lang po ito na listahan nila. Kailan to?
Huh?
2012, but after we passed the law. Mr. President, Your Honor, this was given in 2012, but some
Yes.
adjustments were made after that.
That's correct.
And we
yes.
are simply adopting in the proposed measure what they now recommended. But there is a catch-all phrase, Mr. President, if I may finish the enumeration, and if I may quote, when deciding on the range of offenses to be covered as predicate offenses under each of the categories listed above, each country may decide in accordance with its domestic law how it will define those offenses and the nature of any particular elements of those offenses that make them serious offenses.
Anyway, Mr. President, we will be awaiting the proposed amendment of the gentleman, and as we earlier manifested, once we have a copy of the precise amendment that will be submitted to plenary, we will see if there are still doubts in our mind, and we can ask questions or propose amendments at that point.
We will do that, Mr. President, Your Honor, and we will eagerly await the suggestions of the good gentleman on how to improve the bill even further.
Thank you, Mr. President. Next question, Mr. President. Can a private person file a complaint with the AMLC?
Yes, Mr. President, Your Honor, according to the technical team here.
I'm sorry?
Yes, Mr. President, Your Honor, according to the technical team. But it must
Where
be
is
sworn
that?
to.
Where is that in the bill, Mr. President?
Wala sa original. It's not in the law nor in the bill, Mr. President, Your Honor. According to the technical team behind me, that's what the AMLAC has been doing since it was created.
All right. So anybody can go up to the AMLAC and complain that Senator Drilon committed a predicate offense, and under the bill proposed, the AMLAC would have the authority to freeze my accounts?
Mr. President, Your Honor, number one, yes, anyone can just complain, but it has to be under oath, very much like how you file complaints with the Office of the Ombudsman. But it's not in the law, Mr. President, Your Honor. It's how AMLAC has been transacting or doing its business since
So-
it was created.
Is the, that's the,
But, Mr. President, to continue, it does not include a freeze order, and as I said, we will be removing that provision. If at all, it will trigger an investigation of AMLAC, if at all, but
Yeah.
not a freeze, not anything further than an investigation.
can it trigger a petition for a freeze order filed with the Court of Appeals?
Only after finding probable cause, Mr. President, they can file a petition with the Court of Appeals. We already removed what was contained, we will be removing rather what was contained in the originally proposed bill on the motu proprio freeze order of the AMLAC.
Yeah, Mr. President, this is a very sensitive issue. It involves properties which could be subjected to restraint, and therefore we would want that the law is very clear so that every citizen is informed of what the law is. Now, the gentleman said on the record that AMLC has been entertaining complaints from the private sector, and on this basis, probably investigate. Is this proper, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President? There appears to be an admission that there is no authority.
Mr. President, Your Honor, according to them, again, how they have been doing things,
Okay.
a complaint may be filed and that will trigger the AMLAC to perhaps investigate it. In fact, in the past, they have even used media reports as a trigger to investigate. Nasaan? According to them, Mr. President, Your Honor, the legal leg they are standing on, and I'm not necessarily agreeing with them, the legal leg they are standing on is the power of the AMLAC to investigate, even without the Section 7 you read, number 7 earlier. In the original law, the power of AMLAC to investigate suspicious accounts. Yun yung basis daw nila na pag may nagreklamo, o pag may news or media report na may ganito, they investigate it.
Well, at least it's spread into the record. If somebody challenges this authority, that matter is part of our debate today. Now, the bill likewise empowers the AMLC to investigate issue subpoenas and administer oath for a more effective and efficient production of witnesses and documents. First, would a bank deposit be can be the subject of a subpoena?
Mr. President, can we get that again?
The proposed measure would grant to the Anti-Money Laundering Council the power to issue a subpoena.
That is correct, Mr. President.
Now, the question that we want to put on record is, will the power to issue subpoena include the power to subpoena my bank accounts?
According to them, Mr. President, no. That would not be included because only...
Is there anything here in the law which says that, Mr. President? Well, as far as I read the proposed measure, it simply says power to issue subpoenas. There is no limitation. In other words, the question is, what broad, this is too broad, in my view. It does not, it could be interpreted as an exception to the bank secrecy law.
We agree, Mr. President, Your Honor. According to them, it is still covered by the bank secrecy law and therefore would not be covered by their subpoena powers. And we would be open to clarifying this provision, Mr. President, in order to make sure that there is no overbreadth and that there will be no abuse of this particular provision insofar as directly issuing a subpoena to produce bank records from any person they might issue a subpoena against.
Okay, so we will await that amendment if the good sponsor accepts that this is a broad power granted to the AMLC under the proposed measure.
Mr. President, just to clarify, in our proposed amendments to be made, that is not yet a part of it, the one I will give the good gentleman because we will still craft that provision.
All right, as long as there is an agreement between
We will do that,
us.
Mr. President, Your Honor.
Because would this power to issue a subpoena, in my view, in the view of this representation, Mr. President, is akin to a search warrant.
That is, we agree, Mr. President, Your Honor. We will craft the corresponding amendment to clarify this particular issue or matter. But to be fair to the AMLC, that is not their intention as well, to issue a
Okay.
subpoena to require the production of bank records or bank accounts.
Yes, all right. As we said, if that is the intention, well and good. We are confident that that intention will be reflected in the amendment that the good gentleman has promised. Now, my next set of questions is in relation to the freeze order, the authority to issue freeze orders on the part of the AMLC, which the gentleman said will be subject to amendment. So,
Tatanggalin na po namin yan, Mr. President. In the version I will be giving the gentleman after his interpellation, he will see that it's no longer there. The only difference, Mr. President, in our proposed amendment is they can directly file a petition and not necessarily always through the Solicitor General's office. But
I
it
would
would still
endorse
have
it.
to be issued by a court.
I have no problems with that the AMLC be authorized to directly file the petition, not going through the Solicitor General. That is an amendment which is most logical, Mr. President, and we have no objection to that. Now, on page 9, we have added as a power of the Anti-Money Laundering Council to check compliance with this act by covered persons not under any supervising authority. Who are these persons, Mr. President, for the record?
Mr. President, yes, we added this because, for example, it is only in the proposed amendment to the Di ba money changers? Hindi naman exactly covered. Money changers, for example, Mr. President, before was not specifically supervised by the BSP. They were only required to register.
Right.
But under the proposed BSP amendments, we are adding money changers as one of the supervised entities of the BSP. But we don't know yet if that will be passed. So
Yes.
if there is no supervising authority for a particular covered person, such as, for example, dealers in high-value goods, the AMLAC can check its compliance directly, given that there is no supervising authority it can coordinate with.
Right, but those particular businesses are covered as covered persons. Money service business or money transfer companies. They are already covered.
Yes, Mr. President.
Dealers of precious stones, jewelry, etc., trust and company services.
Covered.
Dealers of high-value items. So who, real estate developers, kasi who, we would like to know who are the persons not covered or not under any supervising authority, who AMLC can include under its wings.
We will give you the list, Mr. President, specifically, but according to them right now, one would be those dealing with monetary instruments until the amendment is passed sa BSP. They're covered, Mr. President, Your Honor, but they have no supervising entity yet. In fact, the Bangko Central simply requires them to register. But under the proposed BSP charter amendments, they will be clearly now under the supervision of the BSP, but that is not law yet.
Yeah, but okay, let's take a specific example. Money changers. They are not,
Under
are they a covered person?
Yes, Mr. President.
If they are a covered person, they are not among those in lines 10 and 11 on page 9?
Lines 10 and 11 on page 9. Line 10 and... Mr. President, Your Honor, you're referring to line 19 and 20 to check compliance by covered persons?
Yeah, well, I don't know, my copy says
Sorry, can you give me-
page 9, lines 10 and 11, the power of the AMLC to check compliance with this act by covered persons not under any supervising authority. Just for clarity, who are these persons? That's what we're asking.
The gentleman is correct, Mr. President, Your Honor. Money changers would fall under this because they are not yet specifically under the supervisory authority of the BSP.
Huh? But they are a covered person
They're
already.
covered person.
So if they're a covered person, the AMLC would have that authority already.
Mr. President, Your Honor, usually the AMLC merely coordinates with the supervising authority to ask for compliance of the entities they are supervising. But if there is no supervising authority, then the AMLC directly will monitor their compliance. That's the reason behind this provision.
Example of a
Covered.
non-covered.
Non-covered.
Yeah.
Senator
Okay,
Recto.
Dealers
I'm
of
sorry.
precious
No,
stones.
the question of it should be, who are covered persons who are not under any supervising authority?
Number 7, number 8, and number 9, Mr. President, Your Honor, in the enumeration of covered persons, namely, dealers in precious stones, jewels, and/or precious metals, wala po silang supervising authority. Dealers in high-value items or goods, wala rin po silang specific supervising authority. Real estate developers, according to them too, wala rin pong iisang supervising authority sa kanila. They are required to register like money lenders or money traders, but they are not supervised by any specific government agency or supervising authority.
All right. Just, okay.
Wala ba real estate? HUDCC, HLB. Yes, Mr. President.
Can we go to page 12,
Yes, Mr. President.
Mr. President? We note that line 19, which refers to the petition that will be filed with the Court of Appeals. The phrase by the AMLC is bracketed, which appears to me to delete the authority of the AMLC exclusively to file a petition with the court. It is in bracket. For the record, is it the intention to authorize other petitioners?
No, Mr. President, Your Honor.
So why are we deleting by the AMLC, Mr. President?
Sa propose natin. Mr. President, Your Honor, this is part of what we are clarifying. Earlier, I mentioned to the good Senator that we are authorizing the AMLAC to file directly. Because this section, Mr. President, and that deletion was in line with the motu proprio freeze order, power to issue freeze order by the AMLAC, which we are removing.
Okay.
So we are reverting to this particular, retaining rather this particular provision and adding directly filed by the AMLAC in our
So
proposal.
we will restore the phrase by the AMLC at the appropriate time.
That is correct, Mr. President, Your Honor. Kasi tinatanggalan na namin sila ng power to issue a freeze order
Okay, thank
as
you.
proposed in the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Because in other jurisdictions in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, the anti-money laundering authorities do not have the power to freeze accounts. There is always a judicial action because of the deprivation of property, which is a judicial function rather than an administrative function. So again, for the record, on page 12, line 32, and page 13, lines 1 to 3, this will be, and the rest of page 13, it will be appropriately amended because this refers to the grant of power to the AMLC to freeze.
That is correct, Mr. President, Your Honor.
So we'll just await that amendment. 1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
A minute suspension.
Pero, basahin mo.
Okay. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, we go now to Section 9. This is found on page 14 of the bill. And Section 9 of the bill proposes to amend Section 11 of the existing law. Now, under the proposed amendment, the Anti-Money Laundering Council may inquire into or examine any particular deposit or investment, including related accounts with any banking institution or non-bank financial institution upon order of the Court of Appeals based on ex parte application in cases of violations of this act, when when there is reasonable ground to suspect that the deposits or investments, including related accounts involved, are related to a predicate offense. My first question is, now the amendment would only authorize the Court of Appeals to issue or to approve the application of the AMLC. No other court, no lower court.
Only the Court of Appeals, Mr. President.
Only the Court of Appeals. All right. Now, we notice that the standard or probable cause is changed to the standard of reasonable ground to suspect. In fact, the establishment of probable cause is bracketed, and therefore, presumably, it will be deleted, and in lieu thereof, the phrase, there is reasonable ground to suspect. First, can we find out and spread into the record, what's the difference between the two?
Mr. President, it is an easier and lighter standard, but having said that, this was the subject matter of Senator De Lima's interpellation as well, and she suggested either to revert to probable cause or to simply use the phrase, for her it was better, reasonable ground to believe, which is tantamount or equivalent to probable cause. So in the latest version of the bill, Mr. President, Your Honor, we are using the phrase reasonable ground to believe, which we define to mean equivalent or tantamount to probable cause. But this was upon the suggestion of Senator De Lima, Mr.
If
President.
it is equivalent to probable cause anyway, why don't we just retain the existing provision?
Sinabi ko din yun sa kanila actually, Mr. President, Your Honor. We will do that, Mr. President, Your Honor.
So we will retain the old provision. Now, The next issue is on page 15, line 18, starting with line 18. The AMLC is given the power to randomly inquire into or examine any deposit, investment, trust, or other accounts. What do you mean by randomly inquire? The word randomly is something synonymous to arbitrary.
Mr. President, Your Honor, just to clarify, this applies to the BSP and not to the AMLC.
Fine. Whether AMLC or BSP, they're both government institutions.
That is correct, Mr. President, Your Honor, just to clarify that point. Mr. President, we use the word randomly to mean they cannot use their supervisory powers to look into a specific account, targeting a specific depositor. The intention of the use of the word randomly was to make it a requirement that they cannot look or target a specific depositor or account holder, but simply part of their sampling or supervisory powers, parang survey po na random sampling. If there is a better way of saying it, we are open, Mr. President, but that was the intention. The BSP cannot use this power to supervise, to look into a specific account or deposit.
Whether or not it is the power to look into specific account, whether or not there is a prohibition to look into a specific account, or a broad power to randomly inquire or examine any deposit, we are not comfortable with this. There are no standards that are indicated. It is even more problematic and too broad, considering the definition of suspicious transaction includes anything deemed suspicious by the AMLC. So we are not, I do not know why we grant this power to the central bank or the BSP, and we even deleted the phrase from lines 14 to line 16, which indicates the period on which the examination is made. No? It says, delete po yung phrase from lines 14 to 16. For the record, what does this mean?
Mr. President, Your Honor, this is not an FATF imposition. This was a suggestion emanating from the BSP itself, which is part also of their proposed amendments to the BSP Charter. We are amenable and open, Mr. President, to revisiting this provision since it is not a compliance requirement of the FATF anyway.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Okay. On the next page, page 16, this is on section 10 of the law, amending section 12 by adding a new paragraph, retention of forfeited assets. The AMLC is authorized to retain 20% of the forfeited assets. First of all, how much would this be if we base this, for example, in 2016? What was the forfeited assets in 2016?
Forfeited assets. It's a run. What I have, Mr. President, Your Honor, is a running balance. the total value of criminal proceeds civilly forfeited as a result of AMLAC action is equivalent to 887,940,874.35. This is as of December 2016. Given the enormity of the accounts that they may possibly forfeit, Mr. President, that's why we put a cap that they can only retain the equivalent of twice the higher budgetary priority in the past 2 years. So last year, the budget of AMLAC was at 40 million pesos, and this year their budget is 48 million pesos. So the 20% will not apply to the entire amount of 887 million given the cap that we placed.
But the cap will entitle AMLC, in that example, to roughly 90 million.
Yes, Mr. President. Your
Now,
Honor.
this is, in other words, we authorize the retention of 90 million in that example without scrutinizing for what use this will be.
Retention or use of income, Mr. President,
Right.
Your Honor.
Yes, the
Yes, that would be
retention
correct,
or
Mr.
use of
President.
income, these are actually public funds which are retained by the agency, and Congress will no longer have any authority to look into how the retained income will be used.
That
Because
is-
this is an authority to use without any without any check on the part of Congress how this will be used.
Well, Mr. President, as your former chairman of the Committee on Finance, I would, of course, be always in favor of any budgetary appropriation or use passing through Congress. But I do not also take it away from agencies to want an own use or use of income provision kung papayagan ho ng Kongreso to a certain degree or limit.
Okay.
We would be open, Mr. President, to amendments to this section if the gentleman thinks that it's too much or if it's not appropriate to earmark certain funds from forfeited assets. This is not an FATF recommendation. Although, Mr. President, Your Honor, nilagay namin na yung use lang kung hindi man sapat na standard yon for AMLC operations and capacity building only. But we will be amenable, Mr. President, to any suggestions coming from the good gentleman. I am a child.
Now, on page 17, under the title Administrative Sanctions, which is on line 9 on page 17, line 9, which seeks to amend section 15 of the existing law. What we noticed is that in the imposition of administrative sanctions, the entire two paragraphs are being deleted, but most significant part of the two paragraphs is the requirement of due notice and hearing before the AMLC can impose sanctions, including monetary penalties. In fact, in the proposed amendments, on lines 26, it says the AMLC may, at its discretion, impose upon any covered person, the directors and officers, for any violation of this act, etc., the following administrative sanctions: warning or a fine. Now, why are we deleting the phrase after due notice and hearing and substitute it with a full discretion on the part of the AMLC?
May I request for a minute suspension, Mr. President?
1 minute suspension. Mr. President, 1 minute suspension. Mr. President.
Session suspended.
Huh. No, page 13. Okay.
Kailangan naman talaga. Whether okay o hindi, kailangan nyo naman
What page is that here?
Hindi, ba't naka-parenthesis siya?
Ito.
Pinalitan
Page
nyo.
15.
Hindi, pinalitan nyo, dinelete yung amendment nyo, dinelete nyo yung buong provision and replaced it with a new provision, which did not include notice of hearing. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, they were surprised as well. We thank the gentleman for his input. It should be included when they deleted the entire section, Mr. President. However, lame my excuse will be, it was an oversight that it was not included, because it's not a question of it being an imposition or not. It is required by our due process of laws, provision in the Constitution to so provide this. Otherwise, we will run afoul to the Bill of Rights. We will make the corresponding adjustment, Mr. President. We thank the gentleman for pointing it out. It was an oversight on our part.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, just going back on Section 9, this is on page 14. On page 14, which we earlier touched, there is a matter which which this representation skipped. The provision on Section 9 would allow the Anti-Money Laundering Council to inquire into bank deposits even without a court order in cases involving kidnapping, comprehensive, the Dangerous Drugs Act, the anti-graft, plunder, swindling, etc., etc. There are about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. There are about 18 offenses which wherein the AMLC is authorized to inquire into the bank deposits even without a court order. Does the gentleman confirm our reading of this?
We added, I will just count, Mr. President.
How many?
We added 12 offenses
12
to the
offenses,
existing,
yes.
to the existing, to the existing 5, Mr. President, to the existing enumeration of 5 offenses, Mr. President, Your Honor.
For the record, can we have first the 5 offenses?
The one in the existing law, Mr. President, is kidnap for ransom,
Yes.
dangerous drugs,
Yes.
anti-graft and corrupt practices.
Yes.
May I request a minute to
Excuse
suspension?
me. I'm trying to listen.
Session suspended.
Sorry.
Number 12, number 2, number 1, number 14, and
1, 2, 12, 13, 14. Yun yung existing. Yung balansa, yun ang dinagdag natin. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Under the existing law, those covered or included already are the following: KFR or kidnap for ransom,
Okay.
dangerous drugs,
Yes.
hijacking, destructive arson, and murder,
Hijacking.
terrorism and conspiracy to commit terrorism,
Yes,
and financing of terrorism.
all right.
In the proposed bill, Mr. President, Your Honor, we are adding anti-graft, we are including anti-graft and corrupt practices, plunder, swindling, bribery, malversation, human trafficking, Migrant Workers Act, anti-child pornography, child abuse, violations of Securities Regulation Code, cybercrime, and data privacy, which was part of the inclusion in the predicate offenses suggested by FATF. But, I will be forthright too, Mr. President, Your Honor. Dito kasama sa requirement yun, ano? But it is not part of FATF's recommendations for it to be part of the Money Laundering Council's power to look into the bank accounts.
So, which of the additional 12 are included in the FATF recommendations, or none of them?
None, Mr. President, Your Honor, according to them, since these were added as predicate offenses in the proposed bill,
Yes.
they suggested that this be added here too.
Who they, Mr. President?
The MLC, Mr. President, Your Honor.
The MLC. No. Would the gentleman sponsor agree that this is in the nature or akin to a search warrant? Inquiring into bank deposits?
A minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session is suspended.
Banking court. No, this is on the inquiry. This is on the bank inquiry. Section 9K. Hindi ka freeze order to. No, the question is it equivalent to a search warrant?
Sa search warrant, Senator, kasi ang difference talaga natin ng pagkakabot sa search warrant. When you search warrant, is kung ano yung indicated.
Kung may illegal.
But in the inquiry, wala eh. Wala kang nababasa.
Ito naman po, hindi kailangan ng FATF.
So yung provision dun sa PDCPO,
Mr. President, ready to zoom.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I'll try to simplify the answer. According to the MLC, they do not consider this as equivalent or tantamount to a search and seizure, which requires a court order. Sa simpleng salita, pwede lang silang tumingin, hindi sila pwedeng humipo o kumuha, according to them.
Sa ating saligang batas, tingin man na hindi kasama ang hipo, ay kailangan pa rin ang utos ng ang pahintulot ng husgado.
We submit, Mr. President, Your Honor, although both of us are not engaged in that anymore, Mr. President. But we will submit to the gentleman's wisdom on this matter, of course, especially from a former DOJ secretary.
We have checked the Constitution on this, Mr. President. And if it is in the nature of a search warrant because you inquire into the deposits of a depositor. Now, if we do not know how to classify it, if it is not in the nature or akin to a search warrant. What is it if it is not akin to a search warrant? When you start to examine the bank deposits, when you start to search the bank records, what is it? If it is in the nature of a search warrant, there are certain standards provided in our Constitution in order to allow a search of one's property. The privacy in one's property, the privacy in one's premises is inviolable.
Mr. President, Your Honor, if I may. The authority they are citing is the Supreme Court decision in the case of Republic versus Eugenio, I'll just spread it into the records, GR number 174629, dated Valentine's Day pa, February 14, 2008. Let me quote in their briefer. In addition, bank inquiry order under the AMLA is an extraordinary provisional relief which the AMLA may avail of to effectively combat and prosecute money laundering offenses. Clearly, the quantum of evidence required for bank inquiry order should not be compared with the requirements of a search or arrest warrant because they are not of the same nature. Considering the foregoing, the lower quantum of evidence required for the issuance of a bank inquiry order in this case is proper. But this might apply also just to this case, so we will compare notes with the authorities of the good gentleman as well, Mr. President, Your Honor, in order to be sure that we are not violating the Constitution on this point.
Yeah. Yes, we will therefore await the final position that the gentleman would take insofar as this particular issue is concerned, especially considering that this is not among the provisions which is required of us in order to be compliant with standards set forth by the FATF. So we will await that position of the gentleman, good sponsor.
But just for the record, Mr. President, Your Honor, it's an existing provision with respect to certain predicate offenses. The proposed amendment simply seeks to expand or include additional predicate offenses in the list. So we will be reviewing the provision itself, Mr. President, Your Honor, and not only the additional predicate offenses.
Mr. President, there is an amendment that we change the standard from probable cause to reasonable ground to suspect. And that is why we asked earlier what is the difference between the existing law and the proposed amendment, because from our own research, a reasonable ground to suspect is a lower quantum of proof required. In fact, reasonable suspicion is the standard required before a police officer may stop and question or frisk an individual against their will. This is the decided cases on this point. And therefore, when we lower the standard, it allows more power to the AMLC. The anti-money laundering law, Mr. President, is to make sure that we align our financial system to the international standards. If the international we should align ourselves, no question about it. That's why I am not objecting to the bill itself, because indeed we need this. Otherwise, we will get into problems again in terms of our being aligned with international standards. But I hope that the AMLC will carefully look at the Constitution, which provides for the protection of the citizens as against the power of the state. The state has all the remedies. The Constitution precisely is a limitation on that otherwise unbridled power of the state as against the individual liberties. So that is why we're quite concerned, and we should always be concerned about the ability of the state to exercise its vast power versus the protection of the rights of the citizens under our Constitution. And one of those is the right against unreasonable search and seizures.
We agree, Mr. President, Your Honor, but again, forgive this representation, but in one of our proposed amendments to our bill, we are reverting back already to either reasonable ground to believe or probable cause, and not anymore reasonable ground to suspect. In fact, mentions of the phrase unlawful activity, we all made it uniform to simply refer specifically to predicate offenses, to remove any cloud of doubt what we are exactly referring to, and to make the powers more limited in a sense to only specific offenses or crimes.
All right, so we will eagerly await the proposed amendments, and in the meantime, we suspend our interpellation. We may have questions, we may have none once we see the proposed amendments. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'd like to thank Senator Drilon for his inputs and suggestions, and for sharing with us his experience and his wisdom with respect to this bill, with a view, of course, to improving the same and making it compliant, not only with the FATF, but with the constitutional provisions as well. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you to both gentlemen on the floor. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1256 under Committee Report Number 13.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1305 under Committee Report Number 29.
Committee Report Number 29 is in order.
Mr. President, this is the expanded maternity leave law. The parliamentary status of the measure is in last Wednesday. We already terminated the period of interpellations, so we therefore move to open the period of committee amendments. May we now move to open the period of committee amendments first.
Any objection? There being none, committee on the period of amendment is now open.
May we now recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations, Senator Risa Ontiveros.
The distinguished lady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader. Mr. President, may I respectfully introduce as committee amendments the following. Insert at line 24 of page 2, provided further that no notice shall be necessary in the event of a medical emergency. I so move, Mr. President.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is carried.
Thank you, Mr. President. Further, Mr. President, insert at line 26 of page 3, provided further that no notice shall be necessary in the event of a medical emergency.
Clarification,
Yes, Mr.
Majority Leader,
President.
distinguished lady. This is in the nature of an individual amendment, just for purposes of record.
Mr. President, I think the answer to your question is in the affirmative, and therefore I withdraw the motion, Mr. President. I move that we open the period of individual amendments and recognize Senator Risa Ontiveros for the individual amendments.
Senator Risa is recognized for the period of individual amendments. To her committee report.
Yes, Mr. President. Pardon my error, and I stand corrected. So to repeat, but properly now, to introduce these as individual amendments. First, Mr. President, insert at line 24 of page 2, provided further that no notice shall be necessary in the event of a medical emergency. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, motion is carried.
Thank you, Mr. President. Secondly, insert at line 26 of page 3, provided further that no notice shall be necessary in the event of a medical emergency. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Next, insert at line 3 of page 6, after the word salary, or otherwise amount to constructive dismissal. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objections? There being none, motion is approved.
Next, Mr. President, insert at line 5 of page 6, after the word SSS, and the Gender Ombud of the Commission on Human Rights, CHR. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. And last but not the least, insert as a separate Section 14 the provision, whoever fails or refuses to comply with the provisions of this act shall be punished by a fine of not less than 5,000 pesos, nor more than 20,000 pesos, and imprisonment for not less than 6 years and 1 day, nor more than 12 years, or both, if the act or omission penalized by this act be committed by an association, partnership, corporation, or any other institution, its managing head, directors, or partners shall be liable to the penalties provided in this act for the offense. I so move, Mr. President.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Further, Mr. President, good majority leader, I respectfully move to renumber sections 14, 15, 16, and 17 to sections 15, 16, 17, and 18 respectively. I so move, Mr. President.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader.
Thank you. Mr. President, may I have a 1-minute suspension and have a copy of the new Section 14 before I move to close the period of individual amendments, Mr. President?
The session is suspended.
Be ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Thank you. Mr. President, I move to close the period of individual amendments for Committee Report 29, Senate Bill 1305.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Mr. President, I move that we approve on second reading Senate Bill 1305 under Committee Report number 29.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Thank you very much, Mr. President and Majority Leader.
Thank you. Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill 4631 under Committee Report number 36.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved. Corresponding House bill is in order.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is the measure renewing for another 25 years the franchise to GMA Network. Parliamentary status of the measure is that last Monday we already terminated the period of interpellation. We now move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
Is there any objection? There being none, the period of committee amendments is now open.
To introduce the committee amendments, we move to recognize the sponsor, Senator Grace Poe, Chairman of the Committee on Public Services.
Clarification, Majority Leader, period of committee amendments or individual amendment?
Committee amendments, Mr. President.
Thank you for the clarification.
Mr. President, committee amendments are as follows. On page 2, line 10, between the words satellite and or, insert a comma and the word terrestrial. So move.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. On page 3, line 8, between the words provide and adequate, insert the phrase free of charge and the comma. I so move.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On the same page 3 and line, between the words time and to, insert the phrase which is reasonable and sufficient. I so move.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On the same page, line 10, after the word facilities and before the comma, insert the phrase of the grantee. I so move.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On the same page, line 10, between the words the and population, insert the word pertinent. I so move.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On the same page and line, add a slash and the letter S in the word population, then insert the phrase or portions thereof. I so move.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On the same page, line 11, after the word issues, insert the phrase and relay important public announcements and warnings as necessity, urgency, or law may require. I so move.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On the same line, on the same page, line 14, after the semicolon, preceded by the word enterprise, insert the phrase promote audience sensibility and empowerment through, but not limited to, closed captioning, then add a semicolon.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Hence, the entire Section 4 shall now read as Section 4, responsibility to the public. The grantee shall provide free of charge adequate public service time which is reasonable and sufficient to enable the government through the broadcasting stations or facilities of the grantee to reach the pertinent populations or portions thereof on important public issues and relay important public announcements and warnings as necessity, urgency, or law may require, provide at all times sound and balanced programming, promote public participation, assist in the functions of public information and education, conform to the ethics of honest enterprise, promote audience sensibility and empowerment through, but not limited to, closed captioning, and not use its station or facilities for the broadcasting of obscene and indecent language, speech, act, or scene, or for the dissemination of deliberately false information or willful misrepresentation to the detriment of the public interest, or to incite, encourage, or assist in subversive or treasonable acts. I so move.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On the same page 3, line 23, replace the semicolon with a colon. I so move.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On page 4, line 2, between the words facilities and during, insert the phrase of the grantee. I so move.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On page 4, line 18, after the word non-acceptance, insert the phrase of the grantee. I so move.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On page 5, line 20, delete the phrase cut off from and replace it with the phrase not allowed to be aired. I so move.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
On the same page, line 21, delete the phrase the air. I so move.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved. In the meantime, minute suspension.
Please don't read anymore number 14.
Oh, buti na.
Because, yes ma'am, because we prepared withdrawal instead.
Session is resumed. Session is resumed.
On page 7, line 17, after the word franchise, insert a comma and the phrase, the lifespan of the franchise. I so move.
Any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved.
That is all, Mr. President.
Thank you. Majority Leader?
Mr. President, with the indulgence of the sponsor, may we hear the Section 7 as a whole now? How will Section 7 read again? As amended.
But, okay.
Section 4, Section 7.
No,
1 minute suspension, Mr.
A
President.
minute suspension.
Effective upon acceptance given.
So, Section 7 or Section 4? I think okay. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, Section 7 will now read as follows. Section 7, Acceptance and Compliance. This franchise shall become effective upon acceptance given in writing by the grantee to the Congress of the Philippines, to the Committee on Legislative Franchises of the House of Representatives, and the Committee on Public Services of the Senate within 60 days from the effectivity of this act. Upon giving such acceptance, the grantee shall exercise the privileges granted under this act. Non-acceptance of the grantee shall render the franchise void.
No, okay. Thank you, Mr. President. May we now recognize Senator Frank Drilon for a question on one of the amendments proposed by the
Senator
committee.
Drilon
Mr.
is
President.
recognized.
Just to clarify, Mr. President, if the gentle lady will yield the floor.
My pleasure, Mr. President, to answer questions.
May we know if the proposed amendment to Section 10 of the bill is being adopted? I'm sorry that I have to ask this question because I didn't know exactly the status of this amendment. In the bill, in the present franchise, the franchisee may not transfer, merge, or yield control of the corporation grantee without the prior approval of the Congress of the Philippines. There is in bold letters in the form of an amendment of this act. Is that confirmed, sir?
Mr. President, we did not read that amendment anymore. We are
Okay.
withdrawing it.
So, just for the record, this amendment was not introduced,
Yes, Mr. President.
so that the franchise simply reads, in case there is a change of ownership, that the standard provision which says it is not effective without the prior approval of Congress stands, not necessarily in the form of a law.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move that we recognize Senator Ralph Recto for the... No, I'm sorry. I move to close the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
Mr. Mapay.
Any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved.
And I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, so open.
May you now recognize Senator Ralph Recto for his individual amendments.
Senator Recto is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader. I may have two amendments, but before I propose the first one, just a clarification. Section 1 of the bill states that the franchise is renewed for another 25 years from the approval of this act. On the other hand, Section 6, which speaks of the term of the franchise, states that the franchise shall be in effect for a period of 25 years from the effectivity of this act. Lastly, on page 8, under the proposed Section 16 of this bill, it says that the act shall take effect 15 days after its publication in the official gazette or in a newspaper of general circulation. Do the words approval and effectivity as used in this bill have the same meaning?
Mr. President, I agree with the good senator and accept the amendment used. I think the word effectivity and not approval would be more sufficient.
Thank you for that. So for
Thank you for
consistency,
pointing
we
this out.
use the word effectivity.
Yes, and not approval.
May I now introduce the following amendment. On page 2, line 18, delete the word approval and replace the same with the word effectivity.
Yes, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved.
On the second amendment and my last amendment, Mr. President, on page 4, insert a new section after Section 7, which will be Section 8, which will carry the heading Tax Provisions. This new section shall read as follows. Section 8, Tax Provision. The grantee, its successor, or assigned shall continue to be subject to all applicable taxes duties, fees, or charges, and other impositions under the National Internal Revenue Code of 1997, Republic Act Number 8424 as amended, the Local Government Code of 1991, Republic Act Number 7160 as amended, and other applicable laws. Period.
We accept, Mr. President, we accept the amendment. However, let me put on record the GMA network is not asking for any exemption or preferential tax treatment that departs from the current tax regime in specific laws. We deleted the tax provision because we were of the view that the National Internal Revenue Code, RA number 8424 as amended, adequately addresses the tax regime that governs, number one, the sale of services of the grantees of congressional franchise with the VAT, and two, the income of the grantees derived from such sale under Title II of the said code. On the local taxes, local tax ordinances approved pursuant to Section 137 and 151 of the Local Government Code, RA 7160, govern the local taxation applicable to congressional franchise grantees engaged in broadcast services. Hence, specific laws already deal with the national local taxation of grantees of broadcast franchises. Nonetheless, we accept the amendment by the good senator, and we thank him for pointing it out.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr.
So the
President.
proposed amendment has been accepted. Any objection? Senator Drilon?
Not an objection, Mr. President. But before we vote, we would like to know what is now the difference between the present tax treatment in the present franchise and the tax treatment as now proposed by the good Senate President pro tempore.
Yes, thank you for that question, Mr. President. It aligns now, well, whatever taxes they are currently paying, they will continue to pay. My concern was that in the bill at hand, there is no tax provision whatsoever. The committee deleted the tax provision. It was not the intention of the committee that GMA will not have to pay any taxes. And I said during the period of interpellation that the bill will look funny in the sense that all franchises that are passed through Congress have tax provisions. Deletion of the entire tax provision in the bill, amending and extending the GMA franchise, might give an impression that GMA will be exempted from taxes expressly provided under its original franchise. Although there is a rule in taxation that tax exemption should be granted only by clear and unequivocal provision of law expressed in a language too plain to be mistaken, deletion of this provision would still create a general impression that Congress has exempted GMA from paying taxes. Since the franchise is in the nature of a contract between the franchisee and the government, Congress should not delete but instead provide a section clearly expressing the intent of Congress that GMA's revenues will be taxed during the lifetime of the franchise.
Yes, Mr. President. Thank you for that explanation. The next question is the ipso facto clause found in franchises. How is that applied in this particular case, Mr. President? We are aware of that principle that whatever is granted in one franchise is ipso facto enjoyed by the other franchise holders. I just want to know whether or not that principle is applicable here to existing franchises of other grantees. Just for the record, Mr.
Section 13 of this franchise does have an equality clause.
Sorry?
This bill would have also an equality clause found in Section 13.
The ipso facto clause.
Equality clause. It is similar to the ipso facto clause.
It's similar to the ipso facto
So today it's called an equality clause.
Equality clause.
Now, furthermore, Mr. President, not all ipso facto clause or equality clause in a franchise would be the same with other franchise when in its applicability. For example, the scope of the franchise does not change.
Yes, yes.
Okay?
Well, I'm just interested in the tax treatment.
Yes.
And I'll be very specific so that we can be clear about
Yes.
this. This phrase or this provision on taxation would be applicable now to the franchise of ABS-CBN?
Correct.
Of,
Same treatment.
Same treatment?
Same treatment.
Of Channel 5?
Same treatment.
Same treatment
Same treatment.
for everyone?
For everyone.
And so, yeah, I just want to spread it into the record so that in questions arise later on, we are clear about the intent of the legislature in accepting and voting on this provision in the franchise of GMA.
That is correct.
So just again, for the record, there is no change or favorable tax treatment that GMA will enjoy under this amendment because, as the gentleman said, it is not the desire of GMA to have preferential treatment.
That is correct, Mr. President.
And there is no reduction. Yes.
But will it change the tax treatment of the other
All of them,
TV stations
it will not.
mentioned?
All of them are paying the same taxes.
So the same.
Mr. President.
So we are just stating what's already happening.
That is correct. Because right now, the bill at hand does not have a tax provision. And we are putting a tax provision,
So,
which in effect will be the same for all networks that they
So
pay the
if-
same taxes.
so if there is no tax provision presently, how were they taxed all these years?
No, there's a tax provision on their original franchise, on their
That's-
existing.
Uh-huh.
In the bill that we are considering, the tax provision was deleted. And I am restoring the tax provision.
So in the bill that is being presented, the tax provision was deleted.
Was deleted.
Which tax provision is in the existing franchise?
That is correct.
Mr. President, actually, the equality clause does not apply to taxes, but to benefits in terms of regulatory requirements. And it is already in the general tax provisions that apply and that will apply to any other franchise holders. It doesn't matter if they had it in their original provision or not.
No, I think what the gentle lady is saying is that, for example, if we were to put a different tax provision here, no equality clause will apply. In effect, Congress favored GMA if we did it that way. And I'm saying that our amendment treats everyone the same.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
With or without this amendment, they will be taxed as they are taxed right now.
Yes, Mr. President.
Is that the effect?
Yes, but the point is this, Mr. President. I've yet to come across a franchise passed by Congress without a tax provision. Now, in the original franchise made tax provision, we are extending it by 25 years. That is the nature of the, that is what they're asking for, an extension of the franchise. So why do we delete the tax provision? And that's why I am restoring the tax provisions.
But you're now imposing a different tax regime.
I am not.
Because
It will
before
be
it
the
was a
same.
franchise tax.
No, before it was a franchise tax amended by a law which imposed a VAT on them. Now they will still be paying income tax,
Yes.
value-added tax, all relevant taxes, including local government taxes. So they're treated the same with any other network.
So this clarifies the tax regime and then makes the form also
Proper.
proper because
Yes.
the tax provision is there.
That is correct.
Okay. So the proposed amendment has been accepted.
Yes, Mr. President.
So any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved.
Mr. President, there are two other members who wish to propose individual amendments. So therefore, I move to suspend consideration of House Bill 4631 under Committee Report Number 36 and ask the Senate President to direct the Secretariat to prepare a clean copy for tomorrow's individual amendments of the other members of the Senate.
Let me first direct the Secretariat to prepare the clean copy as requested by the Majority Leader. Any objection to suspend consideration? There being none, we suspend consideration of House Bill number 4631 under Committee Report number 36.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the permission of the Chamber, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1277 under Committee Report number 19.
Okay, any objection? Hearing none. Senate Bill number 1277 under Committee Report number 19 is in order.
Mr. President, this is the Free Internet Access in Public Places Act. Parliamentary stance of measure is that we are now in the period of amendments. So may we recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Science and Technology, Senator Bam Aquino.
Senator Aquino is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Mr. Majority Floor Leader. On page 2, after line 12, insert the following paragraph, which shall read as follows. At the minimum, the program shall be made available in areas within the foregoing public places where maximum use and access to the benefits shall be ensured, such as but limited to computer laboratories and libraries in public basic education institutions and state universities and colleges, main lobbies and hallways of public buildings or transport terminals, and at main assembly points in public parks, hospitals, and health centers. Appropriate signage shall be placed in conspicuous areas of sites with access to the free internet service provided by the program. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved.
On page 2, line 16, after the word permits, add a comma and then licenses.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Page 2, line 16, delete the words certificates pertinent and replace it with the phrase clearances needed for the construction of infrastructure or installation of equipment in coordination with the respective issuing government agencies and departments for. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 2, line 21, after the word program, add a new sentence to read as follows. The revenue collected from local fees, charges, and other local impositions shall inure solely to the benefit of and be subject to disposition by the local government units. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 2, line 22, delete the phrase conduct the necessary public consultations and consultations with and replace it with coordinate with the. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On the same page, line 23, delete the comma after parenthesis NGAS and replace it with the word end. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On the same page, line 23, after LGUs, insert the phrase and conduct the necessary consultations with. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved. Majority Leader?
Will the sponsor read again line 23 as amended?
Why not the entire paragraph as amended?
Okay, from line 22 na lang,
Yeah.
pwede na.
Okay. Mr. President, I have one more amendment to change the whole paragraph, and we can read the whole paragraph, if that's okay, Mr. President.
The reason is, the reason I asked, Mr. President, is that the use of the word "and" twice. Anyways, yes, I will.
Yes, okay.
I will wait for the other amendment, Mr. President.
Yes, thank you, Mr.
Senator Aquino,
President.
please.
One more amendment for this paragraph, Mr. President. On the same page, line 25, delete the word regarding and replace it with the word for. So the paragraph, Mr. President, shall now read as follows. The DICT shall coordinate with the concerned national government agencies, NGAs, and local government units, LGUs, and conduct the necessary consultations with civil society organizations and other stakeholder groups in the development of the implementing rules and policies for the permitting and certification process. That's
An
the
objection?
amended, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Continue, Mr. President.
Yes, continue.
Mr. President, on page 2, line 28, after the word issuances, add the words and agreements. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On the same page, line 29, before the word released, insert the words issued or. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 2, after line 32, insert a new section on private property ownership to read as follows. Private property ownership. The right to private property shall be respected in the implementation of the program. in case the construction of any infrastructure or installation of equipment shall involve or affect privately owned land or property, the DICT shall ensure that the necessary public consultations are held with affected or concerned parties, such as homeowners and homeowner associations, non-government organizations and people's organizations, and local government units before the program is implemented in their respective jurisdiction. Such public consultations shall conform to the manner as stated in Republic Act Number 9904, otherwise known as the Magna Carta for Homeowners, and as specified in Rule 11, Article 54 of the Implementing Rules and Regulations of Republic Act Number 7160, otherwise known as the Local Government Code of 1991. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? This is a new section, right? Any
Yes, Mr.
objection?
President.
Hearing none, approved.
On page 3, line 6, delete the word proscribe and replace it with the phrase prohibit any unfair methods of competition and. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 3, after line 17, insert the following new sections to read as follows. Public-private participation. To promote an efficient and cost-effective delivery of the free internet access for public spaces, the DICT may partner with private individuals and entities in the implementation of the program. Private sector participants to the implementation of the program shall not be required to secure franchises from the Congress and local government units. Excess capacity may be offered to deliver internet access service for compensation to the citizens and households in the areas wherein program facilities are located, provided that said individuals or entities register to the National Telecommunications Commission as value-added service providers. In order to lower costs, increase and improve the free internet access for public spaces, private service providers are encouraged to exchange data traffic at domestic internet protocol, IP, exchanges, which may be designated by the DICT. Another paragraph, Mr. President. Transparent usage policy. No fees shall be collected for use of free internet access in public spaces. A transparent usage policy shall be implemented to ensure that individuals will have equitable access. No restrictions or requirements that hinder access shall be imposed, except to implement the transparent usage policy or when there is a clear and present security or technical risk that cannot be remedied through normal technical solutions. So moved, Mr. President.
Just to clarify, these are two new sections.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, so any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, I plan to move a omnibus motion to correct all the numbering,
The numbering,
at
yes,
the
sir.
end. Yes, Mr. President. Next, Mr. President, on page 3, line 18, before the word data, add the term performance and service quality. So moved, Mr. President.
Before the word data in the title.
Page 3, line 18, Mr. President.
Yeah, is it in the title? Because there's another data on line 18. Section 10, data collection, and then another one, the DICT shall collect data. So, which of the two?
The first data. 1 second suspension, Mr. President.
Session suspended.
The official. No, it's the body. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, this is the data, word data in the body.
Okay, so the DICT shall, before the word data, shall
Collect performance and service quality data.
and service quality data. Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the same page, after line 19, add a new paragraph to read as follows. The NTC shall provide minimum standards for quality of service, including but not limited to download speed, latency, packet loss, and jitter for public free internet service. The minimum quality of service standards for free public internet access services shall not be lower than minimum quality of service standards provided for retail basic internet connectivity services offered to the public. So moved, Mr. President.
An objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 3, line 20, after the word publish, insert the word such. So moved, Mr. President.
Publish such information. Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 3, line 20, delete the phrase such as but not limited to speed and stability of, and replace it with the words on the quality of. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 3, line 22, after the phrase without need of, delete the article A and replace it with the words prior approval of. So moved, Mr. President.
Page 3, line
22.
22. Okay. prior approval.
I can read the new paragraph, Mr. President.
Mr. President, may I know from the sponsor on what section that will fall in now? Will it be in the new section 10 or section 10? Because after, on
That's-
line 19, after the word act, you inserted a new section.
Yes, Mr. President.
So what
This is the
happens
old-
to line 20 to 22? It goes to the new section or?
Oh, Mr. President, 1 minute suspension, please.
Minute suspension.
This one, no? Yes, sir. Okay, but that's still section 10, right? It's now section... It's the old section 10. Yes,
But in the old services, per
Sir, we didn't mention this section. Yung pinasok na new section. Sir, yung pinasok na new section. Okay. Right before.
line 19, sabi.
Yeah, I'll correct it. Sir President, ready to resume.
Session is resumed. There is a pending motion. Any objection?
Mr. President, I was provided some clarification by the
Go ahead,
Majority
please.
Floor Leader. Mr. President, we moved to insert after line 19 a new paragraph which read as follows, no? The NTC shall provide minimum standards.
Yes.
This was accepted by the body, Mr. President.
Yes.
Instead of line 19, Mr. President, it should have been line 22 and not line 19.
After line 22,
After line
a
22.
new
Mr. President.
section, a new section.
Section or paragraph? I think it's, the motion was it's a new, add a new paragraph only.
No, I think it's a new section, Mr. President. I remember the sponsor saying it was a new section.
Mr. President, may I have another minute suspension?
Minute suspension. Hindi. Ang rinig ko parang yung new section.
So hindi siya new section? Yes. So tama yung kanina. Tama yung kanina. New section. I made a mistake.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is
Mr.
resumed.
President, I withdraw the previous statement, Mr. President. We are on the right track. May I resume, Mr.
And
President?
that was not a new section. It
No,
was
Mr.
a
President.
paragraph.
I probably misheard, but that's
yes.
what I heard, so that
So-
I wanted a clarification. I'm clarified now, if that is the manifestation of the sponsor.
There is a pending motion.
Mr. President, we withdraw the motion, moving it to after line 22. That's withdrawn, Mr. President.
Yes, sir. Yes, but the other one before that, on page 3, line 22. Are
Yes,
you pursuing
Mr.
that?
President, I have not read that yet, Mr. President.
Okay, please, go ahead.
Mr. President, on page 3, line 22, after the phrase "without need of," delete the article A and replace it with the words "prior approval of." The paragraph shall now read as follows: The DICT shall periodically collect, update, and publish such information on the quality of Internet service and program sites and ensure immediate access to such information without need of prior approval of request. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Approved.
On page 3, after line 28, insert a new section on Free Public Internet Access Fund to read as follows: Free Public Internet Access Fund. There is hereby created a Free Public Internet Access Fund, FPIF, in parentheses, under the management of DICT to provide financing for the implementation of the program. The FPIF shall be funded out of the spectrum users' fees, in parentheses SUF, collected by the National Telecommunications Commission, NTC, and other sources to be identified by the Department of Budget and Management, DBM. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Approved.
On page 3, line 31, after the word technology, delete comma and replace it with the word and. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 3, line 31, after the word commission, add a period.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 3, line 32, delete the phrase, and concerned local government units and national government agencies, including the Department of Education in the case of public basic education institutions, and the Department of Health in the case of public hospitals and healthcare centers. So moved, Mr. President.
Delete.
Yes, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 3, line 35, delete the phrase automatically appropriated out of the spectrum users fees, SUF, collection of the NTC, and replace it with sourced from the Free Public Internet Access Fund. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, the section on appropriation shall now read as follows. The amount necessary for the immediate and effective implementation of this act shall be charged against any available funds of the Department of Information and Communications Technology and the National Telecommunications Commission. Thereafter, such sums as may be necessary for the implementation of this act shall be sourced from the Free Public Internet Access Fund. Any deficiency in the budget requirements for the implementation of this act shall be included in the Annual General Appropriations Act, Mr. President. Mr. President,
So noted, yes.
due to the new sections, the Secretariat, we move for the Secretariat to make the necessary adjustments in the preparation of the clean copy of the bill, Mr. President.
Motion should follow.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's all. Maraming salamat, Mr.
Thank you
President.
very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. May we ask the Secretariat for a clean copy for tomorrow, Mr. President?
Secretariat is directed to prepare a clean copy for tomorrow's use.
I move that we close the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
Individual?
Committee amendments muna. Individual ba ito?
We were,
No, we're not ready to close the period of individual amendments, Mr. President, because there are two other members of the Senate who wish to introduce individual amendments. But to facilitate and to make sure that we are not crisscrossing on the sections, we will wait for a clean copy before the other members of the Senate introduce their individual amendments.
This was an individual amendment.
so the motion is to suspend consideration.
Yes, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1277 under Committee Report Number 19.
Any objection? There being none, so suspended.
Ako wala na. Baka yung iba po yung business. Hindi ko alam kay
Mr. President, I move to adjourn. I move that we adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Tuesday, February 28. I withdraw the motion. Mr.
Senator
President.
Drilon is recognized.
Just a request before we adjourn. In today's agenda, number 4 in the agenda is the Committee Report number 30 under Senate Bill number 14. This is the indexation of the values found in our 1930 revised penal code to update them to present values. We have discussed this with Senator Lacson, who is scheduled to interpellate. Senator Lacson and I agreed that we have it for tomorrow. So can we just have it as the first item on the agenda so that we can, this is not a very difficult bill. This is a upgrading of the monetary values.
I'll try to work that out tomorrow, Mr. President, as of now, because earlier we agreed with Senator Francis Pangilinan that the COCO levy be taken up. But I will schedule it as what we have agreed upon. I'll make the request of of Senator Drilon to the second. But we can talk to Senator Pangilinan that we take it up first. Anyway, it's
Because I'm afraid, Mr. President, if we put Senate Bill 1233 ahead, then we might as well, accept the proposition that we cannot take up this other bill. This The interpellation will be very short, from what I understand.
All right, then I will make sure that that is what we will do, as requested by the distinguished gentleman from Iloilo, Mr. President.
Thank you, Majority Leader. Yes, Senator Ontiveros, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I also respectfully request that Committee Report number 17 on Senate Bill number 1271, or an act prohibiting discrimination on the basis of SOGI and providing penalties therefore, through the kindness of the Majority Leader, be scheduled again tomorrow. I would just like to note, Mr. President, that today is the 5th session that this bill is scheduled for interpellation, pero hindi po natuloy. I spoke earlier to Senator Pacquiao, and he told me that he will no longer interpellate, but later on introduce amendments to the bill. And I had been hoping that Senator Villanueva and I could have the interpellation. Since apparently it is not going to happen today, I respectfully request that it be rescheduled again, and early enough in our agenda for the day tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader.
Yes, Mr. President, we will ask the Secretariat or the Rules Committee Secretariat to include it in the agenda tomorrow, but I suggest that the distinguished lady talk to the interpellators, because we've always been placing it in the agenda, but the interpellators are not ready. They have been asking for a day or so afterwards. So I suggest that they talk privately so that they can schedule when the interpellations can start.
I will do, Mr. President, and I thank the good Majority Leader for faithfully scheduling and rescheduling this bill for interpellation. I reiterate that when I asked him on the floor earlier, Senator Pacquiao said that he would introduce amendments and no longer interpellate. But yes, I will talk to Senator Villanueva to try to ensure that our interpellation will proceed tomorrow. Thank you, Majority Leader. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I move to adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Tuesday, February 28, 2017.
Any objection? There being none, session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Tuesday, February 28, 2017.